Hi everybody, I'm Jack Jinseki, and joining me today is Mildra the Monk.
Hello.
So this is a first for my channel. Mildra is actually the first guest that has come back for a second interview. This is pretty cool. And he is, of course, uh, he of course just created a new game, a tabletop RPG game. And can you tell us the basic gist of that?
So, I am the lead writer and developer of the of Legend Edition, which the full name is Final Fantasy TTRPG Legend Edition.
Mm-hmm.
It is, as the name implies, a Final Fantasy based tabletop role playing game that I have been developing over 4 years, and recently, at the time we are recording this, it is now in a state that I consider feature complete. There
Mm,
are still some kinks to iron out and some things that didn't quite render the way they were supposed to,
of course.
but I don't plan on adding anything to the text.
Mm,
This is a total of three different books: a core book, a bestiary book called the Enemy Intel Field Guide,
mm-hmm.
and a advanced rules book called the Ultimania Guide. And all three of these combine to nearly 800 pages of total content,
Oh wow.
uh, because of the goals that I had with it and the shoulders that I was standing on with this project.
Hmm. So me, I have very limited background with TTRPGs.
Mhm.
Where would you recommend I start with your books?
Uh, with this one, all roads lead to the core book.
Mm-hmm.
That is where the majority of the rules are going to be. That's where our introduction and how we define role playing games and video game RPGs comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that is also where we keep a lot of the rules that are essential for both players and GMs to get started.
Okay.
And do you understand what the definition of what a um, role playing game in the tabletop sense is?
Well, from me, at least, this is when I think of role playing games. I think you have multiple people, you have a dungeon master or DM, and the DM sets up a scenario in advance utilizing the rule book and applies different stats and weights to all of the potential actions or predictively some of the actions the players might take, and then part of it is developed in advance, and then during the game the other part of it is developed on the fly in order to simulate an experience in the collective imagination.
Hmm. Now, the there is a certain definition that I have written in the book. In fact, it's on page 2
Ah.
within the prelude chapter. And this is a definition I've used reliably as a unified theory kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
A role-playing game is a form of group storytelling with rules that dictate the mechanics of player success and failure.
Hmm.
These rules enhance the experience in two ways. They make the story more compelling by providing concrete gauges of a situation, and provide the players with a series of interesting strategic choices.
Hmm.
Because a lot of things that people think are needed for a role-playing game, there are exceptions to that rule.
Hmm.
Like the whole thing with the GM. There are some games that are GMless, like Mystic Imperium,
Hmm.
or some games that don't even use dice, such as Amber, which
Mm-hmm.
doesn't use any randomizer at all. Some use cards instead of dice, like Dragonlance Fifth Age. And there are even games out there that do not require a group, that are solo games, like the Lone Wolf game books.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also plenty of RPGs like Dragonbane or the like that offer rules for solo play,
Mm-hmm.
which is why I focused on that definition to work around a lot of those exceptions.
Okay. So, what do you feel? Can you give me an example of how your game might work around some of the more traditional, like the definition that I provided?
Mhm.
Would your game work around any of those basic details in any sort of way?
Now, my game is somewhat traditional in the sense that you are using dice, you do have a GM and the like. However, it is built with one of the pillars of the design. And I'll get to the pillar. I'll get to the whole pillar concept later.
Mm-hmm.
Is customization.
Hmm.
So if somebody wanted to do a rotating GM kind of setup, um, it is flexible enough to support that. We outright encourage people to do house ruling and home brewing and just hacking the system
Hmm.
as we have it.
Hmm.
And I do hope down the road that I'm able to do homebrew challenges and homebrew jams um,
Hmm.
for instance my Discord server.
Hmm. How often do you say you do that sort of thing?
I have not done that yet, but it is something I have considered in the future.
Mm-hmm. Do you do any gaming on your server at all, or are you just talking about this specific scenario?
Uh, I do plenty of actual plays and the like um, on streams. I haven't done a server based game in a while just because of things not matching up the way I'd like.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm certainly not going to say no to the concept.
Do you feel that there are any tabletop games that inspired, uh, like a good chunk of the design choices you made?
There's quite a few.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them I have listed out in the first few pages,
Hmm.
and a lot of them are previous attempts at doing Final Fantasy in tabletop form because this Final Fantasy is in a unique spot where there is a direct chain of games and a kind of lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent a bit of time talking about this. It goes all the way back to the Returners project in the mid 90s,
Mm-hmm.
which went through three editions. Then a lot of the people within that project split and did their own things. Some people, like one person, developed the Zodiac system.
Hmm.
Another developed a D20 hack for Pathfinder. Another group developed developed things like the D6 based approach.
Mm-hmm.
Like everybody split off and essentially did Final Fantasy, but did in different ways. And then you started to have people who took what was there and did their own thing with it.
Hmm.
There was the Omega Fantasy Project by a man known as Omega,
Mm-hmm.
and the fourth edition project by Bruno
Mm-hmm.
over in Brazil. There was also Bahamut Academy, which I'd like to have delved into more, but it's in Portuguese, so I can only do so much.
Hmm.
Uh, there are also games like Shadow of the Demon Lord by Robert Schwalb that served as a significant influence, as well as games like 13th Age,
Mm-hmm.
which was developed by Rob Heinsohn and Jonathan Tweet,
Hmm.
who are the lead developers of Dungeons and Dragons Third and Fourth Edition,
Hmm.
respectively. Uh, well, reverse that, I should say. Uh, there's also stuff like Fantasy Craft, which was a very significant influence because of the style of customization that that game has, and projects like Legend System, which was a attempt to try and make a better D&D Third Edition in the Giant in the Playground forums, which is a hotbed of homebrewing.
Hmm.
Just a rabbit hole of people making really fascinating homebrews of all different stripes.
Yeah.
And this was a homebrew challenge that ended up evolving into becoming its own game,
Hmm.
which is a I should note that that is a very common thing. a lot of people a lot of people end up home brewing or house ruling their way into making a game.
It makes sense. I mean, if you were doing something totally experimental and you stumbled upon something that was actually really fun, wouldn't you want to expand on that? Obviously, you
Yeah.
did. Uh, so you mentioned the other Final Fantasy editions. Just out of curiosity, is there any sort of canonical element to any of these, or is
No,
it okay? So it's all kind of just fan made for the
they're
most
all
part.
they're all fan made. Some of when I say this lineage, what I'm mostly referring to is having similar staffs
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of those early projects.
There,
Um,
there was a canonical Final Fantasy tabletop role playing game though, wasn't there? Like early on.
no,
No.
the most the only canonical one is the one on 14 that recently released, and TTRPGs in canon is not going to be the same as say um, canon when it comes to a TV show or or a comic book.
Mm-hmm.
It The canonicity is more about word consistency, and that doesn't really apply here because a lot of these entries are more focused on providing a toolkit to run Final Fantasy inspired campaigns.
Hmm.
So there isn't really a set world.
Gotcha.
There's a bunch of themes that are arranged kind of like random Lego bricks in that blue bucket everybody had as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
But this isn't like say Warhammer Fantasy where there's the set world of the old world
Hmm.
that everything focuses on.
Speaking of theming, it occurs to me from what I have seen of the genre. I should preface by saying that I have very limited familiarity with Final Fantasy, but it sounds as though the game series itself features very disconnected stories for the most part, and that there isn't really one holistic vision of what Final Fantasy is supposed to be. Although there are certain thematic elements that tie in together. Would you say that's an accurate description?
Yeah, I would say think of it like mythology.
Hmm.
Within mythology, you have recurring elements per se,
Mm-hmm.
but it isn't like the different stories in the mythology of any culture has some unifying canon tie that brings everything together. There isn't some unified story in
Hmm.
that sense. You have a collection of stories.
So how did you go about making um, something that was Final Fantasy themed, but without any major plot points to necessarily fall back on?
This is as good a point as any for me to go into the pillars
Okay.
philosophy that we had, and this was something that we established before we wrote any rules.
Hmm.
There are three pillars that our design had, and I have to correct myself. There are four pillars. I forgot about the fourth one, and these pillars are a case of the phrase "all roads lead to Rome."
Hmm.
You know, every single thing that we do has to reflect on these pillars. And the first one of those is mythos over setting. This is because one of the questions that we get asked is what game are we basing it on? We're basing it on one, or we're basing it on seven, or we're basing it on tactics, so on and so forth. The answer is all of them and none of them.
Hmm.
The approach we are going with is taking a lot of the recurring elements, you know, crystals, the different types of magic, airships, recurring creatures like bombs or cactuars, a guy named Sid,
A Sid. Yep, I was thinking that.
and saying this is the blue bucket of Legos that we're giving people.
Hmm.
We're not interested in having a defined world, but rather a defined theme that can be interpreted in how a table wishes it to. Because once the book is in the hands of whatever table is going to be running it, it's out of my hands.
Hmm.
I'm not their dad.
Of course.
Um, a lot of the predecessors I mentioned before, like the Returners Project or Bahamut Academy or the Seed Project, a lot of them skewed very much towards the SNES era of mixing high fantasy and Japanese steampunk.
Hmm.
One of the things I had said from the outset is I wanted something that was equally viable in that style of fantasy just as much as the more modern or futuristic takes
Hmm.
with minimal house ruling.
Hmm.
House ruling is going to be inevitable, but I feel that house ruling should be a spice,
And
not a dish.
as someone who is has limited familiarity, what would you call house ruling specifically? Do you have like a definition for that in mind?
House ruling or homebrewing is when someone is adding additional rules that are not officially in the rules or modifying them. They're not far removed from modding in a video game.
Okay.
Uh, this is this is not far removed from custom rules that one might have in a board or card game.
Gotcha. So like the like Monopoly when there are some people who decide things to do with free parking.
Yeah,
Okay.
or Uno has a lot of these to the point where there are whole editions of Uno that have just collected fan submitted house rules,
Hmm.
or you have you have things like the 7 card draw rule in Magic the Gathering, which isn't an official rule, but some people use it for their own games, or the mana drop rule, where you drop any lands that you have in your hand in that sense.
Hmm.
Uh, some people will, with TTRPGs, some people will go a step further and introduce whole new archetypes, whole new ways to build characters that aren't in any official material.
Hmm. So, you've talked about some of the other games in the series. Do you find that there is a significant community around the basis of Final Fantasy inspired tabletop RPGs?
Yeah, I mean, this is a thing that people have been tooling around with since the mid 90s.
Hmm.
And there's been a lot of different projects and a lot of different takes. Some people adapt an existing system like D&D or Savage Worlds or Fate into Final Fantasy. Some people have made their own setups. I'm certainly the ones that I mentioned with that direct lineage are just the tip of the iceberg of the ones that exist. There's whole Reddits and Discords just dedicated to Final Fantasy meets tabletop.
Wow.
Uh, there's there's quite a few people who've done it, and there's plenty of people who've made their own games that are dipping into the concept in all but name.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm doing with this is not necessarily new. This is just my team's spin on the concept.
Hmm. I mean, it does make sense because the creation of Final Fantasy, from what I could tell, the whole purpose of it was to, back when it was a more novel concept to incorporate RPG elements into a video game, that would kind of extrapolate backwards to tabletop. Sounds like it makes sense.
It was a lot something that is important to note regarding this whole video game and tabletop relationship is it is nowhere near as segregated as I think a lot of people believe it is to be, especially in Japan, where the way TTRPGs evolved has a far closer relationship with computer games because that's where the scene sprang from.
Mm.
It didn't spring from a miniature wargaming scene like it did in the U.S.
Mm.
Uh, and Final Fantasy is built off the back of the likes of Dragon Quest and Ultima.
Mm-hmm.
Dragon Quest was built on the premise of taking what was in Wizardry, which was heavily rooted in D&D's design philosophies and simplifying it for the Famicom.
Hmm.
Because Wizardry was really, really big on the PC Engine back then, and still is. There's Wizardry games that were made primarily in Japan.
Hmm. So, I mean, and it, now that I think about it, it kind of makes sense because the computer is effectively a tool. And
Mhm.
so it's a tool for automation of redundant processes. So a tabletop RPG, for example, can have a lot of things that are redundant about it, like repeated rolling of a dice that you can just simply be replaced by a computer. So, I don't know. That's just how my brain kind of thinks. Uh,
Huh.
so, about your involvement with the project specifically, where did your journey with tabletop in general begin? Would you say?
Uh, it began when I was very, very young.
Hmm.
Uh, like before I even got into middle school, and I was a massive bookworm in those days. I still am.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have just a few books lying around. I have multiple shelves worth of books, like it's a small library. And one particular thing I really enjoyed was the choose your own adventure books.
Oh yeah.
You know, the old thing of, and it wasn't long before I realized that there was a similar thing with dice and the like, known as game books.
Mm-hmm.
One of the more popular examples of game books is the Lone Wolf series by Joe Dever, uh, which has gone through multiple books over the years, and some of them have had reprints. There was one video game adaptation, but it's Lone Wolf has been around a while, and it is a whole setting of material unto itself.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also been stuff like the Fighting Fantasy series, which was developed by um, Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, the
Yep.
co-creators of Games Workshop. Um,
And it's funny you
and
bring that up. It's because those books are the reason that Final Fantasy was called Final Fantasy and not Fighting Fantasy.
yeah, I was always and the eventually I was talked into trying out Dungeons and Dragons for the first time, and this was the Black Book era of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Second Edition, because this was in the '90s,
Hmm.
and I really enjoyed the concept. It was built on what I was already doing, just with more steps,
Hmm.
and because of that, I eventually took the reins as GM for my own things. A lot of those early campaigns were absolutely horrible. I had no idea what I was doing. Uh, but when you're that young, you usually don't. Eventually, I branched out to other games because I didn't even back then I didn't believe in just focusing on one game exclusively.
Mm-hmm.
My mentor always beat it into my head to expand my horizons,
Mm-hmm.
and I just never stopped. I was always looking around for things, and when I started finding out about custom rules that were put up on the internet, that was a floodgate opening.
Hmm.
And especially in the 2000s, I would come across sites like the Forge or the TG part of the Chance, where people were making not just custom rules for existing games, but whole games themselves.
Wow.
Uh, and as it kept going, I just kept experimenting more and more,
Hmm.
and and it was always a treat whenever I discovered things, and that's why it's apropos that that we're recording this on the day that it is, because this is free RPG day,
Oh. Cool.
which sort of like free comic book day, but just with RPGs.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of stuff helping to promote it with my local game store over the years. But the point is that I started at a young age, and tabletop and its design is something that I even though I have known a lot about, I always feel like I don't know enough. I'm always looking for something to discover, and I always find something to discover.
Hmm. So, was there a reason? I know you said that um, this game evolved from what was effectively homebrew rules. Was there a reason that you decided to create the tabletop game around Final Fantasy specifically?
Uh, Part of it is just being a fan of the series since I was a little kid, but I'd say one of the other reasons is this the whole idea for doing this originally started when I did an episode of the Geek Watch podcast that I do
Mm-hmm.
that talked about adapting various jobs into the track system that Legend System has.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea wouldn't leave my head after we did that stream.
Hmm.
And I started tinkering with the idea more and more until I realized that this has some legs where I could make a full-on game out of it.
Hmm.
But as soon as I realized that, I stopped myself and said, okay, if I'm doing this, then I need to have a clear direction of how this is going to go so it doesn't fall into the trap of a lot of projects that people do where they miss the forest for the trees in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
Or another way to put it is that a lot of people, when they say that they're making a game inspired by an IP, have this idea that they need to include everything from that IP, or they over focus on the mechanics before they've even nailed down what the game is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a pet peeve of mine. I've seen people talk about making their own game, and and instead of talking about what their game is about, they're talking about the way the die is supposed to work or the way character creation is supposed to work. And I'm like, you're not even at that step yet.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. There are people who always go on about their projects and they get down into the weeds and then they find a reason not to do it at all just because of some minor problem that should be way down the road.
Yeah, and you look in various forms of the creative process, whether it be in films, whether it be in video games or the like. Some of the ones that end up going up in flames were because there wasn't a clear direction from the start.
Hmm.
Uh, I remember watching a documentary on the, for lack of a better term, shit show that was Mass Effect Andromeda, and how they didn't have a clear direction for a long amount of time, or they hyper focused on one particular thing until which they should have realized in hindsight wouldn't have been viable. In that case, it was procedurally generated planets.
Yeah.
And they spent the better part of a year working on that before they scrapped it and instead downsized it.
Hmm.
Uh, if
Proceed.
I
Oh, sorry.
if I was in that call, I would have said, "Do not do procedurally generated planets. People with much bigger budgets can't even do it."
Yeah, procedural generation seems to be one of those things that it's way overhyped, but as far as I can tell, totally unnecessary.
It has its place, but doing whole maps procedurally generated ends up with maps that don't have very strong identities.
Yes.
I think that's the reason. I pointed out what this is one of the many reasons why Starfield didn't hit the mark and why people have really soured on that whole procedurally generated world kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that can work in small scale, like say rooms in a roguelike.
Yes.
Whether that be Binding of Isaac or Hades or the like. But when you're doing whole maps, it becomes a problem just because of the sheer scope. And also, it results in maps that don't have a very strong identity. And depending on the game in question, map design is very, very important.
Yes. It is how the player is guided through the system, and so the game designer is effectively informing the player how to think more or less in this alternative scenario. And so if you don't have that sort of specific guidance, then the player doesn't know what to do. And I remember playing the was it the commentary version of Portal. They have these little talk bubbles, and you click on it, and it'll tell you the design choices that were made for that stage. And I remember it was very, very important that during play testing, players were able to understand why they were doing the things that they were doing at any given point. And I don't see any way you could do that if the entire place is randomized.
Mm-hmm.
So, you have a strong familiarity with Final Fantasy. Do you have a favorite installment of the game?
Um, not necessarily. I know for a lot of people when they cover this, they'll talk about which ones are their favorites, which ones they don't like, which ones they think should never have existed or anything like that. That's not how I approach it. I approach each entry. I approach as its own beast, and I don't approach it with this idea of how things are supposed to be. I'm well aware that I'm getting a different experience every time I pick one up, and honestly, that's the fun part for me. There are certain ones that I have an appreciation for for things that they introduced or things that they made me rethink. Uh, I've talked about having a fondness for 8, even with all of its flaws,
Mm-hmm.
because 8 and Chrono Cross, I played around the same time, and I will always be in favor of playing games that may not be the most polished, but have very strong ideas that they're exploring.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I guess I could say it's a incarnation of my love for the garage band experience kind of thing. You know, the guys who have more passion than common sense.
Yeah.
Um, and in that same vein, while maybe 6 or 7 might be more polished or might have better writing, giving me an experience that I did that was new to me at that time is something I will appreciate more. And in its case, it's the whole use of spell charges instead of MP, which is something that I was not the biggest fan of in something like D&D. I've I did a whole video talking about how I do not like what's known as the Vancian model, named after Jack Vance and his Dying Earth books. But the approach that was done there, was one that did not have a lot of the issues that I have with that approach. So, so that is one angle. I'm also fond of 10 for having a means I can showcase to people that your brand of fantasy does not need to be a Western European pastiche.
Hmm.
Because Ten's approach to fantasy, it is doing a mix of modern and fantastical elements, but its visual style is more akin to parts of Asia in general and the Philippine Islands in particular.
I always found it peculiar that it seems as though every time somebody does a fantasy game, it basically just rips off Tolkien.
Yeah, I have a term that I call the Tolkien Melting Pot, and let me be clear on something. I don't have anything against the works of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Of course.
I've read those plenty of times. I enjoy them. I'm not going to read them enough to speak Elvish. That's never happening. But sorry.
That's okay.
I've enjoyed the books. I enjoy the movies, even if they make several changes, because when you're adapting, you kind of have to make changes.
Mm-hmm.
I've enjoyed several of the games. There's been a few TTRPGs in Middle Earth that I've enjoyed. I did a whole retrospective on that some years ago.
Mm-hmm.
What I resent is this idea that that approach to fantasy is what I have to do.
Yes.
Not that it's a good idea to do it, but that I have to do it because it is fantasy.
Hmm.
And I know this is a repeat problem because I remember going on forums and seeing people say that the likes of Planescape was too weird to be fantasy.
Hmm.
You know, like Planescape Torment, especially.
How about this one? This is one that I've seen, is that someone will take this standalone game or series or whatever, and because it contains characters that are the Tolkien landscape, but they change attributes about it, they get really ticked off. Like, the elves aren't supposed to do that.
That is encapsulated with another saying within my shows. That being designed by gospel.
Hmm.
And what I'm talking about with the Tolkien Melting Pot also touches on this. I resent this idea that you have to design things a certain way solely because you have to solely because that's the way it's been done in the past. You know, we do things a certain way because we've always done things a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Except if that certain way doesn't quite fit, I don't see a reason why that should be there. In a lot of TTRPGs, there's a concept called Rule Zero, which is the rules are here for entertainment. If a rule is getting in the way of the fun, modify it or throw it out.
Hmm.
No, there are people who play strictly to all the rules. This is referred to as raw or rules as written, but it's not something that's actively encouraged, and my game certainly doesn't.
Uh, so, first of all, have you written or created any other games in the past?
I've created a few. A lot of them no one will see because either I don't like the way they turned out, or in some cases I just don't have the material anymore. It got lost. Um, when I was in high school,
Mm-hmm.
I made a card game called Legend Wars,
Mm.
and Legend Wars. If I did some digging, making maybe I can find the rule set for it, but all the cards for it I don't have anymore. It was me messing around with Magic Set Editor, which I still have that program. It's really really good
Nice.
for make and trying to make my own game using its framework. So there's a lot of visual similarity to Magic the Gathering in it,
Mm-hmm.
but different contexts. Um, I remember having a kind of I thought it was cute by having a kind of rock paper scissors approach when it came to combat. I thought it was cute by having neutral mercenary units that both sides could bid for, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the ideas were undercooked because it was my first game.
Of course.
I made a board game called Age of the Elements that was me trying to mix uh, uh, elements of a trading card game with a board game, and I thought I was so genius for doing that until I realized or was actually told that that's been done plenty of times over the years. I just didn't see it. It was a very humbling experience,
Man, that
and
that realization hurts, doesn't it?
oh, it hurt. But the thing is, some people would take that realization and just not continue with development.
Yeah.
I took a different approach. I looked at that and I said, "Cool, I got more stuff to study and learn from."
Hmm.
And that there are plenty of games that I will read through, but I won't necessarily play simply because I like studying the different designs. And this, but getting back to the whole design by gospel thing, you mentioned using elves as an example.
Mm-hmm.
When even in mythology you have what is the equivalent of elves with different interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm being honest, when somebody says, "Oh, you can't have elves do that," what they're thinking of is this idea that the Tolkien style elves have to be the default, regardless of setting if you're using elves.
Hmm.
Which, if we were to take that kind of thinking to its logical conclusion, then would we have to argue that that if somebody wanted to do a superhero comic, that it has to be in the style of the Golden Age comics?
Hmm.
Uh, Somebody can certainly do that. There's nothing stopping them.
I
But
know that I know more than a few people who would argue that they should, but you know. uh,
possibly, but I think a stronger argument would be needed than just this is how it's been, than what's been done in the past.
of course.
Oh,
So, one of the things that I've noticed when talking to you and a lot of the things that you post on social media, etc., is that you have a very strong, ingrained philosophy about what gaming is supposed to be, or at the very least, uh, certain aspects of gaming, what they're supposed to be, and how we're supposed to look at them. How do you feel that that informed your process for writing this game in a significant way? I mean, obviously it did, but how do you think that it informed your writing process?
I think it did in the sense that there's a lot of elements within Legend Edition that one could see as direct responses to things that I have as pet peeves within other games.
Hmm.
Um, Even something as mundane as having an index in the back. There are some games I've covered that don't, and that has sufficiently annoyed me. Uh, because if you're dealing with a large core book and you need to look up a particular rule, not having an index means you got to be doing a bunch of page flipping, and that's not fun.
Yeah.
And things like having bookmarks in the PDF or just proper navigation is the umbrella that I use for this kind of thing.
Hmm.
Or even things like having a monster creation system. One could see that as a response to games that do not have that and just have a monster manual but not much guidance for building your own adversaries.
Hmm.
Uh, the approach that I do with Magic is certainly a response to my issues with how some games handle that approach. That or ones that treat martial characters as Babby's first character, essentially.
Hmm.
That's been a pet peeve of mine, going all the way back to when I did my early D&D adventures, where I didn't like the fact that the fighter was doing nothing but basic attack, while everybody else had all these other things that they could bring to the table. And at the time, I was told fighters are not supposed to be powerful. And even as a little kid, I thought that was bollocks. Especially when you have dozens and dozens of martial characters in mythology that can hold their own and beat mages and
Hmm.
do and that there's also the fact that reducing the complexities of hand-to-hand combat or range combat or whatnot into just a single
Fight.
dice roll just does not sit with me.
Th-
I'm willing to accept it to an extent when it comes to technical limitations in like a video game, but you don't have that problem when you're dealing with a tabletop game.
that is one of the things I've noticed about RPGs is that when you're playing it in a game form, at least, you know, the mage has 20 different spells, and the fighter basically does one thing and one thing alone.
A lot of that is a consequence of where TTRPGs came from.
Hmm.
Now, D&D itself is a successor to a war game called Chainmail.
Hmm.
Chainmail was very much a successor to the um, war games that gained a fair amount of popularity in the 1970s.
Hmm.
And in those kind of setups, the mage was meant to be the parallel to an artillery unit in an army,
Mm-hmm.
and when you're dealing with army versus army kinds of war games, which these were, you don't really have the design space to give individual attention to each soldier or each knight or what have you. But as TTRPGs evolved into what they would become, that was one of those things that needed to change when there was more of a focus on people playing individual characters rather than whole armies.
Mm.
But it ended up sticking around, in my opinion, longer than it should have because of the tradition argument. Of it's worked perfectly fine so far.
Mm.
And I've seen, and I think this is why looking at the tabletop scene in Japan or the like is fascinating, because that's not really a problem there.
Mm.
Because of the fact that that it evolved more from the computer gaming scene, not the wargaming scene, and it didn't evolve out of D&D particularly. D&D certainly had a foothold at one point, but it hasn't had a major foothold in Japan since the early 80s,
Yeah.
because they sat on their hands too long when it came to translating a D&D, and never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. Other people stepped in.
So, this is more of an abstract question. Did you take any inspiration for your game outside of Final Fantasy and tabletop games in general?
I would say yes. And even though I listed a short list of inspirations, whenever it comes to any project I do, it's never just one or two inspirations. It's always a collection or an aggregate. I think the last time I was on, I told you my journey to becoming a VTuber, and it wasn't just from watching an existing VTuber. It was a gradual chain of events over the course of years that led to that next step. It was a form of natural progression. And when it comes to the design philosophy I had, a lot of it was built around those pillars and built around the kind of game I would want to play at my table.
There is a certain power in being able to say, we're going to do this the way that I want it to be done, and you can actually manage how you create that.
So it's not. I hesitate to say it that way because it sounds like I was on some kind of power trip when I wasn't.
Well, yeah. Well, you can. I mean, like me, for example, I like to. I do some amateur woodworking on the side. And I have the ability to, if I am building a piece of furniture, I can build it the way that I want it and not the way that I see it in the store. And that way, if I want to make it the sturdiest thing in the house, I am free to do that in whatever way I want. And so that gives me the ability to make decisions for myself of what I want something to look like, rather than being told externally this is what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and if someone tells me that there's a certain way things are supposed to be done, I won't just reject it out of hand, but I have to have an understanding of why it's done. Otherwise I'm just following along like a puppy dog.
So, while you were creating this game, what would you describe as the major hurdles for you to overcome?
I would say balancing was one of them when you've got a bunch of moving parts. I'd say another one was figuring out what to keep and what not to. Because the pillars thing is not a buzzword. It is everything that we do in the game does not if it doesn't fit those pillars, then we won't do it, or if it's far too situational. It's that sort of thing is what was key when handling design.
So, who do you think you would say helped you the most in the creation of this game?
Uh, I would say people like Xanatrix, who is my editor in chief, and he will insist on being called the editor in chief at every opportunity. Think of it like the meme of a pimp named Slickback or a tribe called Quest. You got to say the whole thing.
Of course.
Uh, but having him to bounce ideas off of throughout the process, as well as understanding the goal, certainly helped. And we would have these weekly sessions for months where we would go through how we would design each of the characters and each of the archetypes. Sometimes he would help me if I've written myself into a corner where there's an idea there, I just don't know how to translate it onto the page.
Mm-hmm.
And occasionally we would bump heads about it, but we bump heads about everything because him and I have the fortune and misfortune of being similar people.
Oh dear.
On one hand, it means that we get on because we understand where someone's coming from. On the other hand, it means that we push each other's buttons a lot and know how to push each other's buttons.
So you've talked about balancing. How did you go about conducting play testing for your game? Did you do? I assume that some of that went on.
Oh yeah, there's been a fair bit. Some of the playtesting happened without my involvement. Some of it did, which was mostly just going to my local game store and saying, "Hey, I'm trying something now. It's a work in progress. You guys interested?" Kind of thing. Sometimes it was a case of testing things out in isolation. If I wasn't able to get a full group together. But when it comes to balancing, we take an approach that is a little bit different than some.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people, if something seems overpowered or the like, they will hit the nerf bat. We are a bit looser on it, and Zan has described it as the brawl minus philosophy. For a bit of context, obviously, Smash Brothers Brawl had some infamous balancing issues. Looking at you, Meta Knight, you know what you did. And there was a mod that tried to fix it by nerfing the overpowered stuff called Brawl Plus. Sometime after that, someone made a response mod, in a sense, called Brawl Minus, that instead of nerfing the overpowered stuff, just amped everyone up so everyone is overpowered. Going on the idea that if everyone's OP, nobody is.
Yeah.
And the approach we took was that we wanted to give people the power fantasy, because that is what this kind of thing is at the end of the day. The only time we drew the line when it came to balancing was when we felt that something was stepping on someone else's toes. And this is somewhat a response to some of the busted character setups in some fantasy games, where things like the cleric or the druid in D&D 3rd edition that are essentially entire parties by themselves. Like a cleric can use similar weapons to the level of a fighter, can cast, can heal, can mess with undead with turn undead, and some of those spells that they can access end up stepping on the toes of the thief with things like knock, which just automatically opens up doors or things like that. When that kind of thing is going too far.
Of course.
And we are big fans of risk reward systems. If you take one option, you're giving yourself a potential weakness in other options, and because that kind of mitigates that sort of issue. The other thing is we have it where if we feel like something is rendering another particular build or another rule redundant, then we will address it. some of this comes from the when I did a deep dive on the mechanics in the Halo games during the Bungie era, and I remember going through Reach and having a lot of back and forth with folk regarding the armor abilities.
Mm-hmm.
Some people like them, some people hate them. I personally am of the opinion that I'm not the biggest fan of them, but not because they make you too powerful, but because they end up stepping on the toes of other parts of the system.
Hmm.
Uh, the big example I give with is the drop shield. You can put that up, and you have a limited time regeneration, which ends up undermining the entire point of having a health and shield system.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of thing is what we wanted to avoid when it came to balancing.
Hmm. Were there any other technical issues that you discovered in the playtesting process?
Uh, some of them were cases of we discovered one particular combination that could be particularly annoying, but it was funny, so we kept it in. Because something to keep in mind with our system is multiclassing and multi-role characters are baked in to the point of almost being an assumption.
Hmm.
You're not you're not just a fighter and that's it. You know, we have the job system where you're mixing three jobs into essentially making a custom class.
Hmm.
Um, sort of like how you'd make custom builds through perks and abilities and the like in the pick 10 system in some of the early Call of Duty games,
Mm-hmm.
where figuring out the right combination for not for optimization, but for the playstyle you're trying to do
Hmm.
is far more important. Like to bring up COD as an example,
Mm-hmm.
a perk like Scavenger, which just means whenever you pick up ammo, you pick up more. The main reason you would take that is not because it's an optimized perk, but because you're going with a light machine gun, which is going to be chewing up ammo.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I mean when I say it's more about emphasizing a particular playstyle rather than the best option.
Hmm. So, um, are there any features of the game that you feel really stand out that you want to highlight to the prospective audience?
Uh, there's quite a few that we enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
The class and job system is one of the big ones.
Hmm.
Technically speaking, we only have four classes: warrior, expert, mage, adept.
Mm-hmm.
But those classes are more akin to a chassis. It's the determining factor with how you develop HP, how you develop MP, and how you develop skills, as well as a class limit break.
Hmm.
But in terms of anything more than that, they don't get there's not very much that they give. Where that comes in is in the jobs. There are about 60 jobs that we have accessed that we've put in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, get as well as a few more in the Ultimania guide.
Wow.
Each class has about 10 or so jobs that are associated with it. You're picking three jobs from that whole pool and assigning one to fast progression, one to medium progression, and one to slow progression.
Hmm.
Each job is a collection of features that are on 7 tiers known as circles.
Hmm.
So a lot of the classic jobs are in these kind of track setups. So this is where you get black mage. This is where you get white mage. This is where you get things like red mage or
Hmm.
thief or summoner. All of those kind of things. And because because of that, your choice of class in traditional games is more about the combination of class and job in this system.
Hmm.
And because of that, each of the jobs is more laser focused on what it does. Um, the other thing we happen to be fond of is instead of having a defined weapon list, which I felt would run counter to the mythos not setting approach,
Mm-hmm.
we instead made a weapon and armor creation system
Hmm.
where you're building it around a set of templates and a set of tags. And this was largely done to avoid what I called a Sisyphus problem,
Mm-hmm.
because around the time I was developing it, I happened to read a Q&A that Brandon Sanderson was doing for Stormlight Archive. It's a really good book series, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody had asked him about the origin of the shard blade in that story. Shard blades are these magic swords that can be called upon and appear through mist by people who are bonded to them.
Hmm.
They are very powerful weapons and can cut through just about anything except other shard blades. And Sanderson had said that he wanted a weapon that would have the same cool factor as when he first saw the Buster Sword in Final Fantasy VII, or when he first saw the lightsaber in the original Star Wars. And taking that into account, I came to a realization that at some point there's going to be some IP. It could be a video game, it could be another TTRPG, it could be a board game, a card game, or whatnot that's going to have some form of equipment that is going to have that same cool factor, and someone's going to want to bring it into their campaigns. So instead of trying to make a defined list, I made a toolkit for people to build that thing.
It's an interesting idea. Instead of giving people things, you gave them the ability to make their own things.
Yeah, and we do have sample weapons in the book, but they're more like pre-gen suggestions than anything else.
Like, do you have like an example sheet or something like that?
Yeah, there within the equipment section there is a spread of that's basically saying if you want to build this particular type of sword, here's a suggestion on how to do it. You don't
Gotcha.
have to do it this way, but it's an option.
Okay.
And the same thing applies with magic items. There's a point based um, budget when it comes to building magic item effects that we have. And we do have a magic item list, and both of these are expanded even further in the Ultimania guide
Hmm.
in a section called Gilgamesh's Summer Collection because we wanted to be a bit tongue in cheek with it.
Mm-hmm.
And but at the end of the day, it is a suggestion. It is your particular take on it is going to be different. Potentially, you could take that route, or you could take a route I haven't thought of.
Hmm.
And it was more about planning for what could potentially happen in the future.
Hmm. So, I know that the game has only just been released, but I know that you've done some play testing with it. How would you describe the reception to it so far?
Um, I have gotten some pushback on certain things,
Mm-hmm.
which is in the same vein of the elf example you used earlier.
Yeah.
Um, One of the major ones was I made the conscious choice to not give, say, paladin white magic as well as its regular features.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the reason I did that is I felt cover was closer to its identity, but also I didn't want it to step on the toes of the white mage.
Hmm.
Uh, so plus, if somebody wants to do that kind of thing, they can just take both paladin and white mage in one other job, and they have that particular typical paladin.
Mm-hmm.
Or there was another case where someone had asked why I didn't put in a ranger job.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I didn't is because everything that a typical D&D ranger could do is handled by a different job.
Hmm.
And that was admittedly, that was one of the things that played a factor into what jobs we would keep and what ones we wouldn't.
Hmm.
If it was stepping on someone else's toes, we wouldn't keep it.
Hmm.
Or if the idea was handled by a different archetype. And I'd say one of the big things has been some folk have assumed that because this uses a D20, that some of the design habits that they see in D&D apply here.
Hmm.
Only on the surface level is that really applicable. Uh, especially when you look at the way the class system works, or the fact that we have a custom monster creation setup that is scalable,
Mm-hmm.
along with a lot of the other things, because customization is king was one of our major pillars.
Mm.
We wanted a very modular affair that could be tweaked in the way that a table wanted to,
Mm.
and because of that, there's a there's a lot of different ways that things can be handled.
Mm.
And but for example, I remember somebody going through it and comparing the berserker job that I have to the barbarian class in, say, D&D.
Mm-hmm.
And even though both have a rage feature, they don't work the same.
Mm.
They like In something like D&D, rage is an alternate state that you have for a set number of turns. In our approach, rage is something that is an alternate state, but the length of it is a game of chicken, because every round after the first that you have it active, you have a higher risk of doing a critical failure. If you do
Mm.
that, you lose the state. So it's a case of how far do you want to push it.
Hmm.
Again, we really like risk reward systems.
Yeah. It's very interesting.
Mm.
I've, I've, I don't. I mean, I've obviously I limited experience, but I've never heard of anything like that before.
Yeah.
Uh, so obviously, it's been 4 years, long
Mm.
time to do anything. If you had to redo the process over again, is there anything you would have done differently?
I probably would have put in some sort of system for effect timing, or something regarding how chaining effects works,
Hmm.
because there was an issue with stacking features, feats, and the like that could get out of hand,
Hmm.
which is why we put in the one source rule, and are going to be putting in an appendix about what counts towards that rule and what doesn't. The the reason for that is I wanted to try and avoid the really really long chain of effect things that you see in like modern Yu-Gi-Oh, where
Mm-hmm.
it's just where you have like chains of effects that go so long it's like a whole minute of just effect into another effect, all over one action.
Yeah.
That sort of thing I wanted to avoid, because I certainly want people to come up with crazy combos, but I didn't want it to overstay its welcome in a sense.
Yeah. And I mean, I've certainly seen that. There are two impacts that when I see something like that. The first is annoyance, because I'm not smart enough to do anything like that, to plan anything out that meticulously that I can get like 30 different moves chained together. And then the second is it's oh shoot, I forgot where I was going with that. So sometimes the magic works, sometimes it doesn't.
Mhm.
Uh, so, uh, why did you choose this as a goal?
To be honest, it was just I've had several colleagues talk about how with some of the ideas that I need to make my own game, or need to or the like.
Mm-hmm.
And for the longest time, I thought, I'm not that good. Um, I'm not sure if I could really do that.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause I do have that bad habit of underselling myself.
Mm.
I kind of hinted at that because it took at least 2 years for me to even consider the idea of doing VTubing,
Yes.
until I finally did back in August of last year.
Th-
Uh,
that's the thing. The most successful people are the most shameless.
and Well, it was more that I felt that what I do wouldn't be a proper fit. Um, I realized the error in that decision, obviously, but
Mm-hmm.
that was where my mind was at the time. not apologizing for it. I'm just noting it.
Yes.
But once the idea got in my head, you know how it is when the muse is on her shit.
Yes.
Once the hooks get in, that idea is not leaving. And even when I didn't want to, I kept tweaking with the idea in my head until the dominoes started falling more and more, until I realized I was starting to actually work on it. And the approach that I took is essentially that meme of there is a line and we've clearly crossed it, but let's keep going and see what happens. Because a lot of it I did it just to see if I could do it.
Yes.
Which is a common thing in a lot of the stuff that I've done, like doing a podcast. It was, oh, let's see if I can actually pull it off. Now, granted, there's a certain approach that I always want to take with projects, but a lot of it is it can be summed up as fuck it, we ball.
So now that you, I mean, it sounds as though you feel that there are some things that still need some loose ends that need to be tied up before you can say you're done. But it also seems as though you're kind of at a place where it's more or less complete. How do you feel now that you have achieved something significant?
I have used it. I have made a bit of a flex on the matter because with so many people who say that they're working on a project and then never finish it, I have been in the state where I can say that I worked on this. I can say that it is done. Hell, that was the reason why I waited 4 months to debut my first VTuber model. I didn't, instead of outright saying, "Oh, I'm going to debut soon." I didn't want the pre-debut stink on me. And in the same vein, I would always talk about how I'm working on this thing, and then Sage happened last year, and I showcased the alpha to say, this is not something I'm just working on in the ether. This is something that is actively being developed. It is getting very close to being finished. And I've seen a lot of projects be worked on and then fall by the wayside, either because of scope creep or any number of reasons. But when I look at this, I can say that I've done it, and something that I hope happens in the future is people use this as their launch pad for getting into tabletop. I realize that's a lofty thing to say, but I've seen that kind of thing happen before.
I mean, anything can happen. And frankly, if you're not designing the thing that you love with the hope that it inspires someone else, then you're wasting your time.
And I outright said I want someone to do what I do and do it better.
And my final question for the interview: do you have any future projects in mind at this point?
There's certainly a few. I know I mentioned to you before that one of my pipe dreams is running a one shot with a bunch of VTubers, but there are some expansions that I have considered when it comes to Legend Edition. One of the things with it is I've come to realize there's the option available for me to take what's here and adapt it into other video game RPGs or adapt it into other campaign settings. And because of that, that is something I'd like to explore.
Mm.
I would like to explore the idea of doing that with like taking what is here and adapting it into, say, the Tales of series, or adapting it into something like the Legend of Dragoon. I had that thought in my head, or other taking other video games with that concept,
Mm-hmm.
or taking other campaign settings. Uh, the campaign setting is essentially a world built around a particular RPG. This is where you get things like Ravenloft or Eberron or the like for D&D, or the or a lot of other a lot of other settings. Um, I have been working on my own setting that I've codenamed Project Gaia, that is doing my own mix of Magipunk essentially,
Mm-hmm.
and the and in addition to that, I've stated that I want to do design challenges. I've got a few where the idea is, say for example, someone design a character build just based on a one word prompt.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it as the nerdiest Rorschach test you'll ever hear.
I've seen stuff like that. Like as someone who used to write poetry, that's a very common thing to do, is to give
Yeah.
someone just like the one word prompt and then have them write an entire poem about it.
Mhm. I also know that it's whether it be an expansion to Legend Edition or something else. I want to write a TTRPG
Hmm.
that uses cards instead of dice.
Hmm.
I firmly believe that a playing card based approach, or just using cards instead of dice in general, is still a largely untapped avenue when it
Hmm.
comes to role playing games. And I the RPG the TTRPGs I can think of that use it are very slim, to the point where I only need two hands to count the ones that I've seen,
Hmm.
even with the hundreds of games that I've seen over the years, which speaks volumes, I think.
Yes.
And that is something I would like to explore.
Hmm.
Um, I also know that um, I want to write a setting that is leaning into a Magipunk, a fantasy Wild West, because as much as don't get me wrong, I love Final Fantasy to death, but one other RPG series that I am very, very fond of since I was very young
Hmm.
is Wild Arms,
Hmm.
with its mix of fantasy and the Old West.
Hmm. That sounds pretty. Pardon my language. That sounds fucking metal.
And it's funny you mentioned that, because I know that one of the other things I've wanted to do is do my own nod to the metal infused world that you see in Brutal Legend, or the Ragnarok TTRPG,
Hmm.
and take my own spin with that.
Hmm.
There's a This is the beauty when it comes to TTRPGs, and why I've been such an ardent supporter of the medium for so long.
Hmm.
Because a lot of the stuff that would be limited to do in video games are like you can do in this kind of thing.
Hmm.
And that's you can do. There is a game out there, or a game being made for just about any sort of fandom, any sort of style out there. If someone is more a fan of space opera, there's options for that. If they're more a fan of samurai theater, there's an option for that. If they're just a complete weeb, there's plenty of options for that.
Hmm. Guilty. Uh, well, Mildra, thank you again for coming out to do this interview. I do
Mhm.
appreciate it. And if you're in the audience right now, I will be posting a link in the side chat and the description to Final Fantasy, the tabletop role playing game Legend Edition. Uh, Absolutely be sure to check it out. Mildra, pleasure talking to you once again. Thank you for coming out. I do appreciate it.
Mhm.
And I'll say from my interview show. I was your host, Jack Jinseki. Goodbye, everybody.
Stay frosty.